Muy buenas tardes. A nombre del rector Enrique Graue y de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, le damos a todos ustedes la bienvenida a esta tarde extraordinaria. A mi parecer, John Maxwell Coetzee es el mayor escritor de nuestros tiempos, que ha hecho una profunda reflexión moral en obras como Desgracia o Esperando a los bárbaros, rectificando la visión que tenemos sobre la migración, la discriminación, las fronteras o la violencia en todas sus manifestaciones y la violencia de género, que ha reescrito el canon de la literatura occidental en obras como Foe o El Maestro de San Petersburgo, que se ha inventado un heterónimo, Elizabeth Costello, que aparece en varias de sus obras para reflexionar sobre uno de los temas que más le preocupan también, los derechos de los animales, que ha reinventado la escritura autobiográfica en 3 libros formidables, o que a últimas fechas, en un aliento metafórico y alegórico de hondas connotaciones morales, reescribe también la vida de Jesús. Para la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México es un enorme honor y un gran placer tener al Premio Nobel de Literatura John Maxwell Coetzee en esta ocasión con nosotros. Él estará dialogando a lo largo de esta tarde con Raquel Serur, profesora de nuestra universidad, una de las más queridas y respetadas, experta en la obra de Coetzee, actualmente embajadora nuestra en Ecuador. Muchas gracias, Raquel, también por estar con nosotros. Que además ha sido ella quien ha hecho posible justamente esta tarde, así que un doble agradecimiento. Un único anuncio: al final de la sesión y solo durante 30 minutos en el lobby de esta sala, John Maxwell Coetzee estará firmando libros solo durante 30 minutos. Les pedimos su paciencia y su colaboración al final de esta charla. Muchísimas gracias a todos y sean todos bienvenidos.
Bueno, muy buenas tardes tengan todas y todos ustedes. Para mí es un honor llevar a cabo este diálogo con John Maxwell Coetzee y quisiera antes de empezar dar mis agradecimientos. Agradezco mucho a la UNAM, al señor rector Enrique Graue, a la Secretaría de Desarrollo Institucional, a la Coordinación de Difusión Cultural y a la Coordinación de Humanidades por haber hecho posible este encuentro. Les comunico que las preguntas las voy a formular en inglés para que el profesor Coetzee me pueda entender y al mismo tiempo la parte en inglés sea grabada toda en inglés y la traducción simultánea sea grabada en español. Entonces, sin más, comienzo con la primera pregunta. I'm going to begin with the first question, John. And thank you for being here. It's a great honor. In the last few years, you have frequently visited countries of Latin America: México, Ecuador, Colombia, Uruguay, Chile, Brasil, Argentina. Your books of stories, Siete Cuentos Morales, was released last year in Spain and Latin America. It has not yet been released in English. John, in the last few years, you have frequently visited countries of Latin America: México, Ecuador, Colombia, Uruguay, Chile, Brasil y Argentina. Your book of stories, Siete Cuentos Morales, was released last year in Spain and Latin America. It has not yet been released in English. Is the fact that some of your books have come out in Spanish before appearing in English to be taken as a meaningful gesture on your part? Is this some sort of a political statement?
Yes. Let me make a prefatory remark. Before I turn to your question, I would like to express my thanks to the Universidad Autónoma for bringing me to Mexico, and to you, Raquel Cerut, for all the time and thought that you have given to composing and structuring this interview. I should make it plain to the audience, you in the audience, that this is a scripted interview, that I have had an opportunity to reflect on Raquel's questions, to get my thoughts straight, and to compose my answers. So what the interview may lose in spontaneity, I hope it will gain in clarity. Now, I turn to your question about publication in the Spanish language. Publishing first in Spanish, or at least not in English, is indeed a gesture on my part. I suppose it is a political gesture within the narrow area of language politics. But to me, its primary relevance is the shape that my career as a writer has taken, and I will try to explain. As I look back over my career as a writer, which extends over 5 decades now, this is what I see. I see a young man, myself, born in South Africa, of an ethnicity that is hard to define. As first approximation, this young man seems to be an Afrikaner, but there are several key features of Afrikaner identity that he possesses only weakly. For example, he does not belong to a Calvinist church. This young man starts writing fiction in an acquired language, English. He publishes his first novel in South Africa, but his ambition is larger. He wants to be published in the real world, which to him means London and even more New York. At the age of 40, already middle-aged, he makes a breakthrough with Waiting for the Barbarians, which becomes a minor bestseller. Thereafter, his books are published concurrently in London and New York as they come out, and then translated into foreign languages, that is, into languages other than English. He has become what is known in the book trade as an international author. But as the years pass, this international author, which is a term invented by the United States publishing industry, finds himself becoming more and more alienated from the United States, particularly the United States of the 21st century, the United States of George Bush the Younger. He dislikes the complacent belief of Americans that their economic system, their way of life, and their culture are destined to take over the globe. As for England, where he has also lived and worked, there is no country where he feels more out of place. He loses interest in the way his books are read and received in the English-speaking world. He becomes more interested in the way they are received elsewhere. He works closely with his translators, and begins to think of himself as an international author in a different sense, a writer who is not located in any particular language or any particular country. It is no longer clear to him why his books, even if they are composed in the English language, should come out first in English and then later in translation in other languages. He tries the experiment of publishing his books in Dutch translation before they come out in English. Then he finds a sympathetic publisher in Argentina, El Hilo de Ariadna. Collaboration with El Hilo opens new possibilities for him. He is able to publish in the southern hemisphere of the world, in Latin America in the Spanish language, in Australia in the English language, and let the North wait its turn if it is still interested in reading him. Thus we have the Siete Cuentos that you mentioned, published last year in Spanish, but not yet in English. And then earlier this year, The Death of Jesus, again published first in Spanish as La Muerte de Jesús.
Thank you, John. Your books are composed in English, and you have made translations from other languages into English. But even as far back as your well-known novel Disgrace, published 20 years ago, you have been expressing a certain skepticism about the English language and trying to distance yourself from it. Can you tell us why?
Yes. Let me speak first about poetry. For whom does the poet write? Answer: for no one or for everyone, but most of all for the language. That was the answer given to an interviewer by the American poet W.S. Merwin, someone whom I honor and respect. And it seems to me a profoundly true thing for a poet in particular to say that the poet wishes to contribute in whatever small way he can to the resources of the language that he uses and that uses him as its instrument. But for me, Merwin's declaration did something else. It illuminated for me the question of why I don't write poetry anymore and cannot imagine myself writing poetry. And let me try to explain. Ever since childhood, I have written in English. As a child, as a young man, as a student, I had absolutely no doubt that access to the English language was liberating me from the narrow worldview of the Afrikaner. I fell under the spell of poets of the English language, particularly modernists like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, and I wrote poetry that imitated theirs. Then, by degrees, the impulse to write poetry grew weaker. When I began to write seriously again in my 30s, I was writing English prose, and it has been so ever since. I write in English, but I've never felt that English is my language, as English must have felt to Shakespeare, for example, or to Thomas Hardy, or to Herman Melville. I have a good command of English, spoken and written, but more and more it looks to me like the kind of command a foreigner might have. This may be the reason why my English is so easily translatable. I've worked closely with certain translators of my books, and it seems to me that the versions they produce are in no way inferior to the original. I can't imagine writing poetry in English, writing with serious intent, because I can't imagine writing for a language that belongs to someone else. So I return to the question you asked of why some of my books have appeared first in Spanish. Siete Cuentos Morales appeared first in bookshops in Argentina before it appeared in the English-speaking world. It does not particularly matter to me that a book I write should not appear first in the English-speaking world, because my books are not rooted in the English language. So that is the first half of my answer to your question about the distance, as you put it, between me and English. The second half of my answer does not take so long to lay out. It is essentially political. I do not like the way in which English is taking over the world. I don't like the way in which it crushes the minor languages that it finds in its path. And here, I think particularly of what is going on in South Africa. I don't like the universalist pretensions of the English language, by which I mean its uninterrogated belief that the world is as it seems to be in the mirror of English. I don't like the arrogance that this situation breeds in its native speakers. Therefore, I do what little I can to resist the hegemony of the English language.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John. During the past few years, you have published a trilogy of novels: The Childhood of Jesus, The School Days of Jesus, and The Death of Jesus. Why, in these three novels, is Spanish the language in which the characters are assumed to speak? And why was The Death of Jesus published in Spanish as La Muerte de Jesús before it appeared in English?
Well, the premise that I ask the reader to accept in these three books is that there is a next life. How you wish to understand the term a next life, whether in a Judeo-Christian way or a Buddhist way or whatever, is up to you. First question, in the next life, how will we speak to each other? How will we communicate? I resist absolutely the idea that English has become so universal a language that it must be the language of the next life too. Perhaps in the next life we will all have to learn Hebrew or Sanskrit or Greek or Esperanto or some unimaginable language of the angels. Who knows? In these three books, we all have to learn Spanish in order to speak to our neighbors. Basta. Of course, it is a paradox that these three books about a world in which everyone speaks Spanish should have been composed in English. But as soon as the books are translated, not only into Spanish, but into any language other than English, the paradox dissolves. The truth is, I should have published all three books in Spanish translation first, but I did not. Circumstances only worked out right in the case of the third book, which was published in Argentina 6 months ago. An English edition appeared just a few weeks ago in Australia. So.
Thank you. These three novels are not set in biblical times. nor do they feature historical Jesus among their characters. Why is the name Jesus in their titles? A broader question. Do you consider yourself to be a Christian writer?
In an ideal world, I would have liked to publish the first of these three novels, The Childhood of Jesus, not only in Spanish, but without a title, and to have allowed the reader to come to the conclusion that the book was about the childhood of Jesus only when he reached the last page. But in the world we have, it is not possible to publish a novel without a title. I don't want to spend time talking about these three books, since I've always believed that a book should speak for itself, and that its author, once he has sent the book out into the world, should withdraw from the scene and shut up. But it is obvious, as you say, that the books are not about the historical Jesus, or to put it in a different way, that the books do not have an historical basis. So let me turn to your second question. Do I consider myself to be a Christian writer? Although I was educated in a Catholic school, I do not come from a family that was religious in any sense. My parents never went to church. We never spoke about religion at home. It is not that my parents were atheists, they just did not find religion relevant to their lives. I myself carried that attitude into adult life. I too never went to church and did not find religion relevant to my life. Nevertheless, I have always been intrigued and moved by the life and particularly the self-sacrificial death of Jesus. I was deeply affected by Pier Paolo Pasolini's film, The Gospel According to St. Matthew, which I first saw in my 20s and watched again and again. Pasolini's Jesus was a wild and intense but fragile man, nothing like the Jesus of institutional religion. At the same time, I was reading the French philosopher René Girard on the subject of violence. Girard himself, though a Jew, was profoundly influenced by Jesus. Girard's great political theme is that the cycle of violence and counter-violence in human societies can be broken only by exemplary sacrifice of the kind that Jesus preached and practiced. So, to return to your question, without being a believer in the ordinary sense of the word, and without being a member of any church, I am someone who has been influenced in many ways by Christian thought, someone who is interested in what Jesus has to say to us, both the Jesus of the Gospels, documents which I may remark in parenthesis are extremely difficult to read and interpret despite their apparent simplicity, that Jesus and the Jesus that one absorbs simply by belonging to a Christian culture.
Thank you. A film based on your novel, Waiting for the Barbarians, was recently premiered at the Venice Film Festival. The director is the Colombian Ciro Guerra. You wrote the screenplay. Though Waiting for the Barbarians was published in the 1980s, it seems to speak to actual issues of today. Would you care to comment? Are there other film projects in which you are involved?
Yes, and you might mention that the film was actually screened on campus yesterday. Yes.
I didn't mention it, but it was screened yesterday, and we suffered it very much.
Yes, well, the title, Waiting for the Barbarians, comes from a widely known poem by the Greek poet Constantine Kavafis. The poem, which is set during the late years of the Roman Empire, tells of a city that is preparing its defenses for an attack by the barbarians. Then a traveler arrives who reports that there are no more barbarians. The poem ends with the people of the city wondering what they're going to do with themselves in a world without barbarians. Their whole sense of who they are has been predicated on the existence of barbarians, defined as those who are whom they are not. My novel plays with the ideas in Kavafis' poem. It asks the question, who are the barbarians? Is it possible that we, the defenders of the city, are the true barbarians? The question seems to me a relevant one, particularly to states that throw all their energies into defending their borders. If there is a central theme to the book, that theme is complicity. The magistrate, the central character, feels that he is complicit in the torture of prisoners, not because he participates or approves of torture, but simply because of his official position as a servant of the empire. I happen to take up this question of complicity again, complicity in its historical dimension, in a book I co-authored a few years ago with the British psychoanalyst Arabella Kurtz. In specific, she and I explore the question of how people whose good fortune rests on a history of colonial repression and sometimes genocide, people like many of us cope with feelings of what I would call historical guilt. Second part of your question, am I involved in any other film projects? There is an Argentine director who has shown an interest in making a television series out of the Jesus novels, but the crisis in Argentina at present makes it difficult to raise capital for a project like that.
Thank you. An exhibition of photographs that you took during your youth has recently taken place in South Africa and Australia. A book of your photographs is due to be published in the Netherlands. Can you comment on your interest in photography?
Yeah, the photographs that you mentioned were taken when I was 15 and 16 years old. Frankly, I don't know why there has been so much interest in them. To me, they seem entirely ordinary pictures of family life in the South Africa of the 1950s. Photography was a hobby of mine as a teenager, but I did not pursue it as a hobby or even an activity into adult life. Nevertheless, I continue to be fascinated by the photograph as a phenomenon, as a trace of the past perpetuated into the present. For some reason, it is the black and white photograph rather than the color photograph that grips my imagination.
Now I turn into something completely different. In one of the interviews published in your book, Cartas de Navegación, you describe yourself as a person who is politically on the left, but is nevertheless alienated by political language. In your Siete Cuentos and elsewhere, you have chosen to address questions of broadly political nature through the language of fiction. Do you think that political questions and more broadly, philosophical questions can be addressed adequately in the medium of fiction?
That's a huge question. Cartas de Navegación, the book to which you refer, was put together over 20 years ago, but I would still endorse the passage you quote. I'm still in broad sympathy with the concerns of the left, and I'm still bored and alienated by the language of politics. The stories of mine seem on the surface to address political or moral questions, do not seem to me to be about politics or morality as such, but about people going through crises of one kind or another, usually moral crises with a political coloring. My approach is therefore in broad accord with the position evolved by Elizabeth Costello, a character who figures in the stories of the Siete Cuentos and in several other books of mine. Elizabeth is a professional writer, a novelist, someone who has grappled with the issue you raise, the question of whether fiction is capable of handling complex philosophical problems. Elizabeth offers not rational analysis of what one might call problems or questions, for instance, the moral question of how we should respond to factory farming, the treatment of animals as if they were objects on an assembly line, or in this case, a disassembly line. She offers not rational analysis, but empathic exploration of what it is like to undergo the crisis of facing such a problem. For instance, in one of the Cuentos Morales, Elizabeth, who has taken up residence in a small village in Catalonia, protects and feeds the feral cats that haunt the outskirts of the village. The villagers are outraged at the population explosion that takes place among these feral cats, and they are justified by encouraging the cats to breed in an uncontrolled way. This foreigner in their midst is upsetting an ecological balance. Elizabeth understands their reactions very well, yet she persists, justifying her actions by invoking images of unborn souls, in this case, cat souls, waiting at the gate for a chance to enter the world and experience life, than which there is no higher good. Who are we human beings, says Elizabeth, to dictate who shall be allowed to live and who shall not? So in stories like this one, I explore not only Elizabeth's passionate beliefs, but her concomitant feeling that her views on the ways in which human beings treat animals are so idiosyncratic, so extreme, that she may be placing herself outside the human community and indeed may be losing her mind. That she, who has always felt she is in the right, may actually have been in the wrong all the time.
In 1987, over 30 years ago, you traveled to Israel to receive the Jerusalem Prize and gave an acceptance speech in which you described the soul-destroying effects of apartheid on both black and white people in your native South Africa. In 2016, you again visited the region and on the West Bank gave a speech, again on the subject of apartheid, which was controversial and widely reported. Would you care to comment on these two visits?
Yeah, I will, and I will be brief. My first visit to Israel took place through the front door, so to speak. I arrived in Tel Aviv on an El Al flight as a guest of the Jerusalem Book Fair. The second visit took place through the back door, at the crossing point between the Kingdom of Jordan and the occupied West Bank, a crossing point under the control of Israeli border guards. I came to the West Bank to see for myself what life was like for Palestinians under Israeli occupation, an occupation which has lasted 50 years and shows no sign of ending. I was under pressure from my Palestinian hosts to publicly agree with their condemnation of Israel as an apartheid state. I resisted this pressure, and for a reason. There are certain words which, in my opinion, it is no longer constructive to use in rational debate, because they are too loaded with passionate emotion. Genocide is one such word. It is not constructive to accuse Turkey of having practiced genocide against the Armenians in 1922. It only inflames tempers and puts a stop to discussion. Apartheid is another such word. It is not constructive to accuse the Israelis of doing in the occupied territories what the South Africans did in their Bantustans between 1948 and 1990. It produces heat but no light. In the short speech I gave in Ramallah last year, rather than joining in the chorus accusing Israel of running an apartheid state, I try to identify some of the objective similarities between the old South Africa and the new West Bank. One such similarity would be residential separation. In South Africa, it used to be that there were areas where only whites were allowed to reside. On the West Bank, there are areas where only Israeli settlers may reside. There are other similarities too. My concern in that speech was to identify similarities between the two systems, but there are indubitable differences too, as Israeli spokesmen will hasten to point out. Whether the similarities outweigh the differences is a question each of us has to decide in a cool and reasoned way.
Thank you. John, you recently published in the New York Review of Books a piece on how Australia, the country where you have your home, has responded to the worldwide problem quote unquote, of refugees and asylum seekers. For obvious reasons, this problem is of great interest to people in Mexico. Do you have any general comments on the question of asylum in the modern world?
Yes, Australia has responded to the so-called problem of asylum seekers with a heavy hand. Although Australia is a signatory of the 1951 Convention on Refugees, which obliges it to give refuge, temporary or permanent, to anyone who arrives on its shores asking for asylum, it has in practice used a range of legal tricks to evade its responsibilities under the Convention. Worse than that, it has imprisoned asylum seekers on remote islands in the Pacific and treated them with exemplary harshness, with the purpose of deterring anyone else from seeking asylum in Australia without going through the regular channels, applying for a visa, etc. Australia provides only an extreme example of the response to asylum seekers that prevails over much of the West. It is not just governments that are to blame here. The official response all too often reflects sentiment among the electorate. What is to be done? I have little to offer in the way of counsel, but a beginning may be made by ceasing to think of refugees as a problem and starting to think of the flow of populations over national boundaries as a fact of life in our world, a flow that is only going to get stronger as the climate crisis worsens. Rather than regarding refugees as a problem to which we must find a solution, it would be better to adjust our thinking and begin to learn to live with the flow.
Some years ago, you published an autobiographical essay called Remembering Texas. Could you speak about the years you spent in the United States and about the significance of your North American education to you?
Yes, Remembering Texas is an essay about the 3 years I spent just across the border as a student at the University of Texas. How did I, as a young man from Africa, come to be in Texas? The answer is that I had taken a wrong turning in my education. In high school, I decided I wanted to become a mathematician. Accordingly, I studied mathematics at university and then worked for a company that manufactured computers. I worked in computers for several years before I started to realize that I was starting to think like a machine, not like a human being anymore. With courage and foresight that I admire in retrospect, I wrote to a number of universities in the United States asking whether they would accept someone who had followed a wrong path but now wanted to start again and work toward a degree in literature. And thankfully, the University of Texas wrote back saying, yes, you can come. So I went to Austin, Texas, where I worked on a doctoral degree. And some years later, I wrote the essay you mentioned about my time there. I was in Texas from 1965 to 1968 during the Vietnam War. The war divided the nation. The public mood was angry. It was not a pleasant time for a foreigner to be in that country. The University of Texas probably didn't provide an education of the highest standard. Nevertheless, the fact is that the University of Texas rescued me from a dead-end career in computers and gave me 3 years to read freely whatever I wanted. My years in Texas were funded by the taxpayers of the United States. Even if I've grown more and more alienated from the United States over the years, I will always be grateful to the American people for their generosity to me at that time.
My last question. Last year, you gave a talk on the effect that your early reading as a child had on the formation of your character. Can you tell us something about this?
Yes, I've recently been looking back over my life, trying to understand how I came to be the person that I am. And in particular, I've been looking at my early reading, convinced that the ideas and images that one is exposed to at an early age must have a profound influence over one, even if one is too young to understand them at a conceptual level. Now, in our home, we had a 10-volume set of encyclopedias called the Children's Encyclopedia. And from a very early age, 3 or 4, I used to page through these books and look at the pictures. Later, when I learned to read, I read some of the simpler material too. The Children's Encyclopedia was an extremely popular British publication. I can't tell you how many millions of copies it sold, not only in Britain, but all over the British Empire of those days, and also in the United States. I don't want to go into detail, except to say that this encyclopedia was not just a dry repository of facts. It also conceived of itself as molding the character of its readers. As we would say today, it was strong on ideology. In particular, a fairly racist ideology in which the highest type of human being was the Anglo-Saxon. In its moral instruction, it laid a heavy emphasis on duty, on doing one's duty, even if it meant sacrificing one's life. The Children's Encyclopedia was not aimed in the first place at a child like me. I was not British. I did not have a drop of British blood in my veins. Therefore, as I read these books, I was, so to speak, overhearing a discourse intended for Anglo-Saxon children. What I could not have been expected to understand was that the Children's Encyclopedia had been written in the 1920s, in the wake of a war in which Britain had lost millions of young men, and in which there were now the stirrings of revolt against the political caste that had sent these young men to their death. The strong emphasis on doing one's duty, preached by the encyclopedia, was intended to counter that spirit of revolution by creating a new cohort of children who, when they grew up, would march off to their death without a murmur. Looking back, I think it was an abominable lesson that the encyclopedia was trying to inculcate in its young readers. I could go on to explore what effect this lesson had on my own young self, but perhaps that can wait for another occasion. So,
Thank you, John.